for the food that and that's about it. I can't think of anything else. Madam President, you're here. Anything else? Anything else you can think of? AJ is right back there, our president. And I think we're good to go. Now I want to introduce Dave Thiel, who did all the legwork to get this podcast going. So Dave, come on up and tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so I'm the Heller Lake Community Club secretary, and I'm really excited that we have the Seattle Nice podcast crew here tonight to basically do their podcast live with us. So I'm going to do a little introduction of our podcasters here. So first we have David Hyde, who is our facilitator for Seattle Nice, and for nearly 2 decades, David Hyde worked for NPR affiliate KUOW in Seattle, most recently as a borough-winning politics reporter. He departed earlier this year to dedicate himself full-time to new projects, including podcasting. Previously, David hosted talk show interviews and also worked as a supervising talk show producer for The Conversation and The Record. And we also have Erica C. Barnett. She's a longtime journalist and editor of Publicola, a Seattle-based news and politics site that she co-founded with her colleague Josh Feet in 2009. Publicola provides insightful, in-depth, investigative, and breaking news coverage of important local issues, including homelessness, policing, and politics. Previously, Erica worked as a reporter and editor for alternative weekly newspapers in Texas and Seattle, and as a freelance writer for publications such as Seattle Magazine, Grist, and Huffington Post. Book, Twitter, a memoir of drinking, relapse, and recovery, is out in paperback. And our third podcaster is Sandeep Kaushik. As a partner since 2009 at Soundview Strategies, Sandeep has broad experience in political and public affairs consulting work in Seattle. In addition to his extensive public relations, political communications, and strategic advisory for elected officials, civic leaders, governments, and nonprofits, he has worked on multiple political campaigns in the Northwest, including numerous issues and ballot measures campaigns. Between 2005 and April 2007, Sandeep worked as a deputy communications director for then King County Executive Ron Sims. And prior to that, he worked as political columnist, writer for The Stranger, and as the Seattle correspondent for Time Magazine and the Boston Globe. I just want to plug Seattle Nice. You can find the Seattle Nice podcast on your favorite podcast platform out there. You can go to Patreon and become a member and help David and the crew here move Seattle Nice forward. Also, we're going to have some Q&A too. So if you guys are interested in asking a question, you can go up to the table right over here, and there's pens and some cards, and feel free to just write a short, brief question on the card. And at the end of the podcast, we'll have a little Q&A session using those cards. So this podcast is, of course, being recorded. So we ask that you try to keep the conversation and any extraneous noise to a minimum if you can. And with that, I want to turn it over to David, and go ahead and do your thing, David.
All right. We're coming out. Before we get going, yeah, you can make any noise you want. I mean, just go for it. It's good that there's a crowd here, and especially at the beginning, it would be great if you start to put up a little bit. So let's do that. And all right, let's start it. We'll get going. All right. Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Seattle Nice. I'm David Hyde, here as always with Erica C. Barnett of Publicola. Hi, Erica.
Hi, David.
And political consultant Sandeep Kaushik. Hi, Sandeep.
Hello, David.
And we're also joined by the Heller Lake Community Club.
How could they resist? We're Mexico's 110th most popular political podcast.
This is our new thing for 2024, Seattle Nice Live. If you want to book Seattle Nice for your next neighborhood association gathering, or we also talked about maybe doing bar mitzvahs, weddings, corporate events available. For folks who don't know, the Howler Lake Community Association is a few blocks. How many blocks off of Aurora Ave? We're right nearby, I'd say. 3 blocks off Aurora Ave. And that's the topic for today's show. We'll be talking about Aurora Avenue. We got a number of questions from community members leading into this event about prostitution on Aurora Ave, including this one from Kippy, who says there are almost naked women walking on Aurora at all hours. I can change this. Erica Barnett, let's start with you. You recently reported that Councilmember Kathy Moore has a plan for change. She wants to bring the old prostitution loitering law back. The city repealed that law back in 2020. Prostitution's still illegal, but you report that the city's only made 25 prostitution arrests since 2019. So just to kick things off, kind of set the stage, why did the council and the mayor decide to repeal that loitering law in the first place?
Sure. Yeah. The loitering law, along with a drug loitering law, was repealed as a result of a work group that started in 2015. And basically, they said criminalizing prostitution loitering specifically is problematic because it criminalizes people for just being in a certain place and being quote unquote known prostitutes. And so that was found to be racially discriminatory. They found a lot of just a lot of sort of racially discriminatory problems with enforcing both of these loitering laws. As you said, prostitution is still illegal. But there have not been many arrests on that particular law. Instead, the city back in Pete Holmes this time decided to go after Johns. And so instead of arresting women, they target people who are buying sex. And I would say even more recently, they've done a lot less of that. So Kathy Moore has talked about bringing back the loitering law, and we can talk about how efficacious that's going to be and whether the police are really going to be able to use that law to enforce anti-prostitution laws in the city. But that's what she said she wanted. And Maritza Rivera, another North Seattle City Council member, says she supports that.
Sandeep Kaushik, political insider. Sandeep Kaushik, what are you hearing from other folks in the city about this loitering law? Do you think there's support for what Kathy Moore's proposing to bring it back?
I don't know yet, to be honest with you. I've had a couple of conversations, but this is a new idea that Kathy floated just a few days ago. So I really don't know whether it's going to get traction or not at this point. I think it's too early to tell. I do know though that I think Kathy's trying to be responsive to a litany of complaints she's been getting from constituents about the kind of what's going on Aurora Avenue in terms of street level prostitution, and as your initial audience member had said, there's a kind of obvious sort of prostitution scene out on the streets a few blocks away from here. And I will say this, like every time I drive up, it actually seems a little better recently than it was a few months ago. But a few months ago, they kind of shut down some of the hotels that had been acting as sort of places where the prostitutes would take jobs for their assignations and stuff. That stuff got shut down. I actually think it's just every time I drive up here, it seems like there's been a little less visible sort of prostitution activity going on. So maybe that's helped some of it. It's still really sad, man. I mean, the level of kind of degradation and exploitation that is clearly going on, is hard to stomach a little bit. And I will say something that maybe is a little bit controversial here, but maybe 7-8 years ago now, there used to be a lot of prostitution and sexual activity, escort stuff happened online. There used to be this national website called backpages.com, and the federal government sort of went in guns blazing to shut it down. I personally think that was a mistake, that sex work was less exploitative and there was, less trafficking, less violence directed at women back then. So anyway, I'll stop there, but
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
I could go on.
That's okay. Erica, if you could respond to Sandeep in a minute also about Backpage, I guess, but same question to you. I mean, is there support, you think, in the city for bringing this littering law back?
Yeah, I mean, like Sandeep, I have not polled the council. I think that we are in an era when a lot of these sort of more punitive laws are coming back. The new drug criminalization law is in effect. The city attorney's office has sort of started prosecuting people who buy sex more, so that law is more in effect. So I can see it happening. I think there is a lot of, maybe not misinformation, but not great information about how many of the people that you see on Aurora are being trafficked and are, as you said, this degradation and, lack of sort of free will and all that stuff. And how many, are in sex work for other reasons. I'm not saying that, it wouldn't be nice if we lived in a world in which sex was not something that, people sort of feel that they have to choose. But I mean, it is a reality. I've lived in the city for more than 20 years. I'm assuming a lot of people in the audience have been here for longer. And there has always been prostitution on Aurora. There's always been prostitution in America. And so I think we need to sort of disaggregate, why are people out there? And instead of sort of saying, oh, they're all victims, they all need to go into safe houses, which is something I've heard a lot lately. That's a very expensive and sort of totalizing idea of what women need who are out there, and it is mostly women. And so there are programs that actually can help sex workers, either get out of that life or, reduce the harm that it causes. And we're just not really investing in it. I mean, LEAD is a program that, can go out and get people enrolled in programs. Right now, they don't have enough money, and right now they are focused almost entirely on the drug law and trying to divert people from drug charges downtown. So it's also a question of resources.
So, and I don't disagree with you that there's a lack of resources that's been put into this, but something that's bugged me about the Seattle left for a while, which is that they seem on any kind of range of issues to be much better at sort of making a critique of the current sort of old school status quo and saying, oh, the old solicitation law had equity issues to it, and therefore let's get rid of it.
That's not the current left. That's a 2015 work group.
Right.
I believe
But
by
the
Ed
council
Murray.
passed that law in 2020, right?
2020, yeah. But
It was the immediately preceding council that got rid of that law. But
I'm just providing a little context, though,
Okay.
because I know you're going to say, oh my God, 2020, everybody was freaking out. This was a very long process that led to this
Yeah.
and a lot of research that went into it.
and I'm not trying to equate this with the lunacy of 2020 and the record stuff. I grant there was a long process that led up to it. My point is that they tore down the law and they didn't replace it with it. They didn't fund the programs or the outreach or the kind of regulatory structures to actually sort of address the potential problems that
They weren't using the law. So you say they tore it down. It wasn't like we went from 100 to 0. They weren't really enforcing that particular law because it was so widely viewed as racist in its application that, that the city was going after John instead. I mean, that was a long process starting in like 2009.
right. Whether it was going after John's, or using the law itself, there were actually efforts going on to kind of reduce the level of sort of street level prostitution that was happening out there on Aurora. And there was less of it for a while, right? And then what happened was they passed this law. The cops stopped enforcing the John stuff to a large extent. The city attorney stop prosecuting that stuff, and it kind of blew up much bigger, right? And it's
What do you think about that, Eric? I mean,
I don't think that that's
you
a
think
valid
that's a good
argument. I think
Because,
that,
I mean-
that stuff stopped way before when you're characterizing it
the
as
Seattle
stopping.
Times was reporting that after 2020, it became sort of open season that people around the country knew that Seattle was a place that you weren't going to get busted if you were trafficking. And that's how the Seattle Times
I've read this
yeah.
particular reporter's reporting
Right.
that you're referring to,
Right.
and I would say that if the word propaganda applies to anything, it certainly applies there.
All right.
But I mean, I guess my larger point is like I'm not saying like, oh my God, like this right-wing council is doing all this crazy stuff in reaction to the left-wing council before it. I'm saying we're not going to solve any of these problems if we don't look at things that actually address them. And I don't think that, instituting a new law on loitering and arresting people for loitering and being in an area is going to address that problem. I think the more you introduce like carceral systems, the more you introduce police into the equation when they don't have to be there, it leads to worse outcomes.
So the city's tried the Nordic model of arresting Johns and getting rid of the loitering law. That's what we've been doing up until now. That may go away. Groups on the left, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, say cities like Seattle should go in the other direction and decriminalize sex work entirely, remove all criminal sanctions. It seems like that's unlikely to be a part of the conversation at this point. I'm just thinking of the different options.
Yeah, the tide certainly doesn't seem to be moving in that direction. I say this. I think that there's a perfectly valid argument to be made that we should, decriminalize or even legalize, right? But do you have any faith that the city, if they did that would result in better outcomes, that they would stand up the structures that are necessary to kind of allow something like that kind of transition to happen in a way that doesn't lead to worse outcomes? And I don't have any faith that they would do that. And again, this is the point I was trying to make. Like, the left is really going to kind of drawing the laws, but then not standing up, not funding the programs, not standing up.
It's not in charge of funding anything right now. So
Measure 110 in Oregon, right? We're going to decriminalize more drug use in the state of Oregon, but they didn't stand up treatment for the other stuff, right? And so the downtown streets of Portland turned into a kind of, semi-hellscape, right? And then the voters rebelled against it. Or
Let's just stay with one. Let's just stay with one. So what about that? Not fully funding this idea, the Nordic model that we've been trying.
Well, first of all, I don't know if the Nordic model is a Nordic model anymore. I mean, that was something from the 2000s that we're still, like, as Seattle likes to do, still sort of catching up on.
We like to be from Norway. We like
to be not very state of the art on what, is evidence-based, in my opinion.
Prosecution now.
But your question is what do I say to sex work decriminalization?
He's saying that terrible last council, just let chaos reign and didn't.
Yeah, we always forget there was a global pandemic on this show somehow. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think that funding some of these solutions is the actual answer to a lot of these problems, going to drugs, going to homelessness. But I mean, right now, I think we're in a situation where we have a council and a mayor that's not going to be able to do that because we have a $240 million deficit. We've got to pay cops, 23% raises, which is going to be tens of millions of dollars adding to that deficit. And so, yeah, we don't have a lot of money right now. And, my solution would be funding evidence-based things that work. And Sandeep's solution would be arresting people for loitering and throwing them into jail because there's no diversion program.
So would you like to see decriminalization or legalization?
Well,
regulation and taxation?
Yeah, I mean, but that's not going to happen. I mean, yes, I do think sex work should be decriminalized, but I think that's somewhat that's a theoretical question in the city of Seattle,
right,
and in the United States generally. So, we're not going to be the first, and I don't think we're anywhere near having that conversation. So I think the better conversation to have is about.
Why is that? I mean, this is a city that we legalize. I'm from Canada, so I don't understand anything that happens here really. But
Texas,
we legalized recreational marijuana before almost anywhere else except for Colorado. Gay marriage, it's kind of a live or let live place. Why wouldn't it be a city that would legalize or decriminalize prostitution?
I'm not opposed to the idea, and I'm not saying I'm supportive of Kathy's proposal to.
I'm asking for you as a political analyst, though. Like, why wouldn't that happen? You think? Are these different issues?
Well, I think it's unlikely to happen because right now there's a public rebellion against what seems like efforts on the left to sort of move towards a more, whatever you want to call it, like Bob Kettle would say, a kind of culture of permissiveness, right? I've talked about radical.
You would say
Did
that.
he get that from you?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Hope so, yeah. Let's go to the best. But so I do think there's there is social harm that's caused by the prostitution that's happening down in Aurora, and maybe some women are doing it of their own volition.
I don't disagree with that.
there's obviously pimps operating out there that stretch between 125th and 30th and 130th and
Yeah.
more, and a number of shootings. I mean, right?
Nobody's disagree. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm saying, well, to answer your question, David, I mean, I think that marijuana and gay marriage are, both sort of nationally popular concept, like getting, legalizing gay marriage, legalizing marijuana. It's happening all over. They are not harmful things. And whereas, like, if you're looking at something like fentanyl, or if you're looking at a sex trade that is by and large very harmful to people, then yeah, it's just a different thing. It's not live and let live. Let's have fentanyl everywhere. It's, live and let live. Marijuana is not harmful and marriage is advantageous. So I think that's why.
I agree with you.
Oh, God.
I mean,
All right, let's stop there.
Yeah.
All right.
Can't have agreement.
Let's turn now to some community questions. We've got about homelessness. Dave writes Seattle Nice. We have quite a few shelters right within 1 mile area near Aurora. What does the city need to do to ensure that all parts of the city share equally and proportionally in providing services to homeless folks? Sandeep, why isn't the city doing a better job in making sure that the entire city share the burdens of, affordable housing, that sort of thing, equally?
It's a good question. And part of it is just the pragmatic realities of citing, citing a permanent supportive housing building, right? The providers are going where they can acquire either land to build or an existing structure that they can convert over to that, and that tends to be in certain parts of the city, right? I'm the board chair for DSC this year, right? And just opened Burbridge Place at 86 and Aurora. It's a 124 units. It's a beautiful building. I was just there at the opening a couple of months ago. It's 124 units for people who had been people who have disabilities, who have been suffering homelessness, and that so part of it is just the pragmatic opportunity of if there's been a move towards hoteling, right? So where are the hotels? You go buy an old hotel, convert it over, right? That happens concentrated in places like Aurora. There's also, like, politics to it too, right? I mean, I agree with you that the city should be spreading the the efforts to address homelessness more widely. I mean, I think Eric and I agree. We need tons more permanent supportive housing. We need tons more tiny home villages, right? And those should be spread out widely across the city. But politics comes into play. Like, it's hard for me to imagine that is going to get a tiny home village anytime soon. But I could see it. I could see one on our first, right? Right.
Broadmoor.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think that in response to this, complain about it, but I mean, the fact the street. So while, if we ever get there, it's probably going to be more shelters on Aurora, but also more shelters, downtown, more shelters all over the place. And I think they should be in Magnolia. I think they should be in Laurelhurst. But that is a that is politically challenging prospect.
Yeah, and to your point, which I agree with that this is part of a solution to encampments and some of the issues we've argued about the socially detrimental aspects that could come out of unaddressed homelessness, right? Of people living on the streets. And EFC's opening a new building in couple months down in Bury, right? And so trying to kind of move into this. Well, I think it's all on track, and the organization has made a commitment. Many of the people that are going to move into that building are people that are currently homeless right now in Bury, right? I mean, it is an effort to help alleviate and address some of the issues that I know, Erica, you've been covering intensively.
Incessantly.
Incessantly.
All right, let's move on to another audience question. This one, I think for Kippy. Is the homelessness issue on Aurora really a homelessness problem, or is it more of an addiction problem? Sort of a chicken or the egg question. What came first, Erica? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that I think all these things get conflated, and you see people on the streets who are using drugs, and causing disorder. And there is an assumption that those people are all homeless, for one thing, which they're not. Um, which, study after study, I mean, you can go to, I was looking at HUD statistics today. It's about a third or less of unsheltered people who have addictions. And so I think that you have to sort of disaggregate that a little bit. I do think, I don't think we can know with certainty sort of when the addiction started or got worse, or, whether it developed before a person became unsheltered on sort of an aggregate level. I think that's very difficult to disentangle, but I do think, and I do very much believe that getting sober or getting into harm reduction or just getting better and also engaging in less problematic behavior, it's really hard when you don't have a home. You go to treatment. I keep hearing treatment first, this term, as opposed to housing first. And, I've been to treatment. You can read about it in my book. It would have been impossible for me to stay sober, which I am, if I had been ejected onto the street, because people are self-medicating when when you drink a beer, you may be self-medicating for something, the hard work day, whatever. And so I think it's hard to disaggregate, but I think we should look at people's, individual problems and solve for those instead of sort of lumping everybody into one category.
Yeah.
Yeah, so same question. Is it a homelessness problem or more of an addiction problem?
Well, I find this argument to be stale and folks who are polarized on the left who say it's entirely I call it kind of Seattle is dying sort of right. He's like, no, it's addiction, it's drugs. You guys are mischaracterizing the problem. And having kind of been on the DSU board since 2015 and kind of worked in these issues, it's an all of the above problem. Like homelessness is a complicated problem, and a lot of factors go into it. Look, I do think rising housing costs are probably the biggest driver of homelessness. There was a national study about 8 years ago that found that in urban areas, when average rents go up $100, that leads to about a 15% increase in the number. Right. So there is a reality there where we're an expensive city, rising rents, really rising housing costs. I'm going to beneficiary of that in terms of that. I live in City Ridge and own a house, right? So I've in some ways, gotten the fruits of that kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, that makes it impossible for them to say. That said, you don't get into DSE housing unless you've got really serious issues, right? Into permanent supportive housing, which typically involve substance abuse issues, addiction issues, as well as often mental health issues, right? All of those things.
But I think you are talking about a subset, like I was saying. I mean, there are different, types of homelessness.
There are. That's a point well taken. And there are a lot of people that fall into homelessness temporarily and then kind of self-exit, right? Somebody loses a job or has some kind of health thing, and maybe they couch surf for a while, but then they find another job. There's a lot of people that kind of fall in and out of homelessness, and we don't sort of. But in terms of really chronic, visible homelessness of the sort that organizations like DSC or Plymouth Housing of issues, and the reason it's so hard to address is you really got to go at all of them, right, to have any hope of kind of making progress. So I just find that this argument sort of silos people into
you need housing or do you need
conflicting camps, and it makes it really hard for us to, pardon my French, fucking solve make progress on solving the problem.
I think
right?
sometimes, I think the intent of that question is sort of a response to what we were hearing in 2019, which was this is only a housing problem, and don't even bring up possibility of addiction if you're talking about homelessness. I mean,
I have never heard anybody
I
really
have.
say that.
I have, but I'm talking about reporters.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, I want to turn to a related question, and not you, but I want to turn to a related question about affordable housing here from oh, this is from myself. So North Seattle City Council member Kathy Moore, who y'all know well, represents you, turned up the heat this week. She's against an affordable housing bill. Question about quorum.
I'm gonna have to stay very calm. I would respectfully request that my colleague, my esteemed colleague, refrain from making any comment on the motivation of the council members who don't not put forth a recommendation for this bill. I hope we can keep it a civil and respectful disagreement on policy and refrain from this vilification of your fellow council members in the media. It is uncalled for. It is unprofessional. We can have a respectful difference of opinion.
All right, that's North Seattle Councilmember Kathy Moore. So Erica, the question to you, what would this, she's talking about a Tammy Morales bill that she voted against and was against. So I guess it's a two-parter. What would that bill have done? And then what is Kathy Moore so upset about?
Well, I want to just note one thing that we didn't get on that audio, which is that she also accused Tammy Morales of calling her evil and a corporate shill and saying that she doesn't care about her fellow human beings, that Kathy Moore does not, or that the other council members don't.
Right.
So it was a pretty extreme statement.
She was really upset.
She's very upset. I have not been able to find any examples anywhere of Tammy Morales saying anything of that sort, and indeed she denies having said anything of that sort.
What's she saying? What's Kathy Moore saying?
What is she saying in response to
Yeah,
Tammy
what's
Morales?
what is she saying Tammy said?
Oh, just that she's an evil corporate shill, or that the council.
Where's the evidence? Like where is she pointing to?
She's not pointing anyway.
Okay,
She said in the meeting. The corporate shill thing, because it's a pro-development piece of legislation that would have basically made it groups that property or in collaboration with other developers. And there were some other, bonuses for building in neighborhood residential areas, so traditional single family areas. They could do that if they provided other types of amenities. And this has been in the works for a while, and it did get community groups, and at no cost to the city. I realize I sound like I'm like a big booster of this legislation. I'll be honest, I did not follow it that closely until it became quite controversial in the last couple months.
Who were the two that voted?
Tammy Morales and Dan Strauss.
Dan Strauss. Okay.
Actually, Dan voted sure. And then the clerk said, excuse me? And then he said yes.
Huh?
But he sort of gave it a very reluctant off mic, sure.
You can see him, but if you ever go to a Ballard FC soccer game, he's there. Dan Strauss. Okay.
Well, I mean, a few things you raised a few things. First of all, Kathy's comment. She obviously went too far. I don't think Tammy ever directly called her a corporate shill or whatever. I think she was kind of mixing Tammy up with Chama Sawant, who always routinely called them all corporate shills.
Because they were on the same side, sort of.
Tammy did impugn the motives of her colleagues over why they were voting against her bill. I think she even said it publicly to the Seattle Times, but I've heard she's also said it privately or wrote in emails to some groups where she basically said, my colleagues don't want affordable housing. That's why they're voting against this bill, or they don't support affordable
She said
housing.
she didn't understand why they weren't supporting an affordable housing.
Yeah, and so I get why. I wasn't just Kathy that found that kind of, irritating. I think there were other council members too that felt like that was an unfair miscarriage. Council member today was telling me I support affordable housing. I just thought there were problems in this bill, and so we want to talk about the bill. I mean, Tammy worked on it for a long time, but we had a new council that came in with a new majority that just came in just a few months ago. Tammy had some conversations with them, but it's hardly like she really worked her bill with her colleagues, right? In a way that built a supportive majority of 5 to pass it.
Do you really think that would have been possible?
The
for
fact
this
that
council?
Dan Strauss, the one other person who voted yes, right
No,
before
he
that,
voted sure.
yeah, voted sure. It's a kind of hurtful amendment to significantly change her bill right before that got voted down.
Well, I think that's emblematic of the fact that Tammy is out on her own on the left on this council. And I think if you're sort of like going to get mad at her every time she fails to pass something and say, oh, well, how dare she be frustrated or express frustration?
I think it's emblematic of
find
the
more
fact that
examples of
she
that.
did make a whole lot of real effort.
Next 4 years, Sandeep,
Right.
every time if that's
Because
be your argument.
Because I think I'll say this straight up. I think Tammy is one of the more sort of ideological and performative council members who'd rather get the win from social media, from the left, and Publicola writing about it and whatever, than she is in actually trying to like get to 5 with people she thinks are a bunch of reactionary knuckle draggers, right? I mean, I think that's really the dynamic that was going on. How can anybody vote? This thing was cooked. And like you, Erica, I didn't follow it super closely until it got controversial. And I recently went back and looked at some of the council central staff memos, when the bill was introduced earlier this year. And what's all over it at the beginning is Tammy was writing this bill because she wanted to kind of give her friends in the sort of social housing and
Well, you're
I-
really talking about impugning motives.
well, read it in the legislation. It talks specifically about public development authorities, and social housing is one of the key elements of what's going to get funded here, right?
I mean, you've
Yeah.
made that quite clear on this podcast before, but
I'm not
think
having
that-
it personally against her, but I think I don't like.
objections from the actual council members, which were not substantive. They were based mostly on sort of incorrect misunderstandings, I would say, of like what the comprehensive, like Maritza Rivera said, we need to do the comprehensive plan first. If we say that about every bit of legislation that has anything to do with transportation or density or housing, then, that's legislation. The other objections were like, it was about all this stuff that's sort of floating in the ether that the council needs to do supposedly before it can do this little pilot project, which is a 5-year project to allow a little more density to potentially to potential developers. I mean, it might not produce any development. I mean, obviously now it won't, it's dead, but I didn't hear any substantive objections to the actual legislation. Sandeep, you're saying it's performative and it was for social housing, but what people said in the council chamber was, we just don't think it's baked, or it's going to provide the wrong kind of affordable housing, or we need to look at the housing levy. We don't know what's in there, which by the way, we do know what's in the housing levy. I mean, it was a lot of stuff that indicated to me that they didn't really know what was in the legislation, but they didn't want to vote for it.
All right, we're not going to get a ton of agreement there, but they're friends. These folks are
Believe it or
friends
not.
for years and years and years. So, despite how it sounds. All right, we've got another question from a community member. Let's turn to policing and crime in the Aurora area. Well, this one is kind of a general question. I've heard SPD deprioritizes everything except robbery and murder, and they don't address lower level crime at all. That's something I hear too from folks. Erica, true or false?
I mean, it's false as a blanket statement. However, it is true that SPD has very much prioritized priority 1 calls, and that's not just robberies and murders. It's all kinds of stuff. It's overdoses, it's assaults, it's major crimes, basically. And so if you call the police for something that is underneath that level, they may or may not show up. I would argue that a lot of times, I mean, in my experience, when I've had to call the police to like report something stolen or my car broken into, I don't really honestly care if a cop shows up at my house at all. I frankly, most of the time, because it takes so long, I'd rather just file a report online. That stuff is not happening as much anymore. That's absolutely true. And if you're calling for like a noise complaint, good luck. I mean, that is not something, unless it's a really, really, slow night, that's not something you're going to get anybody to respond to. So that's absolutely true. But the police department has said that they have gotten their response times for those priority one calls down to about 7 minutes and maybe a little bit over, which is where they've said they want to be for a long time. But they have done that by sort of deprioritizing some of those lower priority calls.
Yeah, just for the sake of the audience and people who aren't like nerds like us about this stuff, but when a call comes into 911, they break it up into 4 different sort of priority categories. So as Eric is saying, they've been really emphasizing responding to priority one calls, which are the most serious crimes. And they try to, send out a response to priority 2, which is the next level down. But yeah, if it's priority 3 or 4, you're very, very unlikely to get a police response. I was just talking with person in the mayor's office maybe a month ago who was telling me, at the East Precinct, on any given night, there's supposed to be 18 officers staffing the East Precinct. And particularly recently, this was about a month ago, they were having 4 available cops in there to respond to 911 calls. And so when you're down that many bodies, it becomes an active triage of what you respond to and what you don't. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you would think ought to merit a response, right? That's not getting it these days.
Now, and I should say, as the token leftist on this panel, David, I guess you're the centrist.
I'm sitting here.
No, I mean,
What does that make me?
There's a lot of stuff that truly, like, having a cop there does not improve the situation. Either it's, a very expensive person to take cops on the street, which is a whole different issue. And there are times when having a police officer there can make things much, much worse, because you're talking about a person with a gun who sometimes responds to crises and is not always as well trained as trained crisis responders, which is, why there have been efforts to fund more of those type of responders. We have 6 right now in the city, which is not enough. They're not responding up here at all. They're barely going out of downtown. I've seen them on Capitol Hill, but
This is the
care team, yeah. And so we need more of that.
All right. And speaking of crime, I've got one more question, and then we're just going to open it up to audience questions. Sort of right after this one will be audience questions for the rest of the night here. To ask about a strange incident that occurred in the fall, or incidents, just because we never talked about it on the podcast at all. So I'm not sure what you think, where a 13-year-old girl and 15-year-old boy were accused of intentionally hitting sex workers on Aurora Ave using stolen cars. I don't know if they were Kias, but they were the type of cars that were
It was like
part of the
Kia
social
one day.
media trend.
Yeah, they were
It
stealing
brings
cars
you
and
to
running
feel-
down prostitutes with stolen cars.
Yeah. And I bring it up because it's the kind of incident that can make people that live in this neighborhood feel freaked out and unsafe. And, what the hell is going on? I mean, it seems like, oh my God, society is just out of control. What can the city do about something like that? What, this new council kind of ran on, we're going to get a handle on this stuff. We're going to rein in the chaos that the old council created. But when I think about policy solutions to something like that, it seems pretty big. So that question, or just what are your thoughts? Maybe let's start with Erica.
Yeah, I mean, there's a horrible crime and a horrible story in such young kids. I mean, the fact is there are certain crimes that it is very hard to prevent. You can talk about upstream solutions to sort of help kids, not go into these, social media rabbit holes and think that it's acceptable to commit, crimes and sort of dehumanize people in this way. But that is a big project, and an expensive one. And, random crimes like that, unfortunately do happen. I mean, I was talking to the King County prosecutors juvenile division head, Jimmy Hung, the other night, and he was saying that instead of joining gang, I mean, this is his, his sort of observation from his work, instead of sort of joining traditional gangs, with geographic, centrality. A lot of kids are just sort of on social media and they, pick these stupid names and they go out and they, commit, sometimes just, crimes like stealing cars and leaving them somewhere. I had a rental car. I had a Kia that got broken into in New Orleans a couple years ago. It was definitely sort of the start of this. But sometimes they commit really heinous crimes. And so we have to, then kind of figure out how to deal with kids like this in the juvenile justice system, so that we can get them.
Yeah, no youth jail, man. I mean,
You're being sarcastic.
I am being sarcastic.
Can you explain
Yeah,
your sarcasm?
I found the whole debate over the whole push for the county was building was intending to build a new youth jail facility, right? Because the old one was dilapidated and they were, housing teenagers. Yeah, right. But there was an enormous sort of pushback against, against that, which to some extent isn't completely realistic, right? Sometimes you do have that crime was just terrible. I remember reading the news story, the Seattle Times story about that crime, and just being horrified by it. And these prostitutes were being run down, and then of course, because they're engaged, calling the police or getting help, and
Right.
just being traumatized and left alone there. It's terrible. The whole thing is horrible. But I do think sometimes people need to, people who commit horrible crimes need to go to the pokey, and I feel like there's
I mean, we're talking about children, so I mean, I do think that I do think that you're sort of, you're hand waving about, put them in the pokey. I mean, you're talking about people whose minds are not developed yet. I mean,
right.
if it was your kid, I don't know how you would feel, but
I think we could work to rehabilitate them too. But if you've got a 15-year-old running people.
a straw man.
Was like gonna settle.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're arguing with the straw man from, you're still mad at 2020. The people said we need to totally get rid of punishment, but I mean, that's not what anybody's talking about now.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna go to some more community questions now. But I've got one here also. Somewhere between once a week and 3 times per night, I'm woken up by shots fired, street racing, and/or loud engine revving. If I'm hearing it, I would guess at least 100, if not 300 or more people are hearing it too. What do we do about this?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer here. I mean, again,
You guys don't have to say anything. You'd be
I
like,
mean, well, I will say, I mean, I think traffic calming has helped in some places. I mean, I used to live right on Rainier, in Southeast Seattle, and I do think that what they did in Columbia City to sort of slow down the traffic goes through there prevented what we had was a lot of people driving into buildings and driving really fast into, and racing too, but just like really reckless, dangerous driving that was very loud. And it did help. I'm not saying that, I know the specific solution for your street, but that does help when you make it harder for people to drive fast.
yeah, I mean, this is again, I think a lot of this stuff gets fueled by social media and young kids sort of copying each other on TikTok, and we've seen this in other cities like Oakland or wherever where you have these really dangerous situations that develop. People doing donuts and doing the huge crowds around them. People end up getting hit, or whatever. And I mean, I our kids, teenage kids and preteen kids not really getting kind of social contact and learning that they typically would have gotten for, more than a year, almost 2 years.
Yeah.
That are lost. I know I had teenage kids during that period, and I know it was really, really isolating and rough on them and created problems for both of them. So I think we're dealing with the consequences of that stuff now, and it's really difficult.
What about James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause? There's no social media back then. All right, here's one about
That was white privilege.
all right, traffic safety question here. We need sidewalks. In this part of Seattle, sidewalks are scarce, but we don't seem to miss them much. Yes, we need safe walks to school for children. This takes us back to our last answer a little bit, and more speed bumps on the side streets. But isn't that all we need? Do we really need sidewalks up here in this part of North Seattle? Should that be a priority? They're expensive, right?
Yeah, I mean, the city does, well, to answer that question, I mean, yes, I do think North Seattle needs sidewalks, in part because, and this is something that came up a lot during the conversation about the transportation levy. It's like, if you don't have a sidewalk and you're disabled, and all of us are going to be at least temporarily disabled at some point in our lives, due to an injury or, whatever it may be, you don't have access to the city. You are either, going to be, especially if you're in a wheelchair or with a walker, you're going to be in the street with cars, or you're just not going to be able to, navigate the city. And so I do think we need sidewalks. There are lower cost types of sidewalks that the city can build, and they're doing a lot more of that. Transportation levy, they're going to announce a larger version of it tomorrow. I think it's going to add, and we're recording this on Thursday. I think it's going to be sidewalks. We'll see. Right now, the original version only funds 250 blocks of sidewalks, which is as advocates said, at that pace, it would take us 500 years to provide enough sidewalks for the whole city. And then, of course, you've got to constantly be repairing them. So, yeah, it's an expensive problem.
I mean, I did not grow up here in Seattle. Like, I moved here in 2002, so 22 years ago. But as I understand the lore, the history of this, right? Isn't this the Great Betrayal, like annexing north of 85th to 145th back in the whatever it was, the 40s or 50s? The promise was that North Seattle was gonna, as part of the annexation, was gonna end up getting sidewalks, and never did, right? And so,
Wow.
and so I do think that's sort of, I don't know. You all may have people in our audience may have better understanding of that, but that's the story as I've always heard it. Right now, so the sidewalks are expensive, and frankly, they're having trouble maintaining the sidewalks we do have, right, which are often in a state of disrepair, or so there are kind of difficult trade-offs in all of these divisions about where
Let the Magnolia Bridge crumble.
yeah, right. I mean, I did hear some people complaining about the mayor not putting enough bridge money into it, though. I thought, he put a couple $100 million in.
Very heavy on
Yeah,
bridge money
yeah,
for the size that it is. I mean, you could definitely make the argument it should just be bigger.
Right. Well, we got a lot of bridges that are in disrepair, not just the Magnolia Bridge. The Fremont Bridge needs work, and there's some other bridges that are expensive to fix.
All right, we're going to continue with questions. This one, how does closing the King County Juvenile Detention Center address youth? So we're circling back to that. Address youth that are continually breaking laws. Sentencing them to home monitoring doesn't sound like it would work, especially if the lack of parenting and supervision is the root of the problem. Erica P. Barnett, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think right now we're at a point where they are going to be closing the youth jail, but the alternatives that they are talking about for some kids involve going to places called respite homes, which is kind of a weird name, but basically where they will be supervised. I think there's a question about, will they be locked? Will they not be locked? Will some parts of it be locked so that kids can't get out? So, I mean, I think there was a lot of fervor around just completely closing down the jail and doing things like electronic home monitoring that has gone away, because I think there are, practical problems when you're talking about kids who are committing violent crimes and doing, and kids who also, maybe may not have stable homes to go to. And so, jail is seen as a better alternative. And so there's so what they're talking about doing now is finding, sort of a midway point for those kids, particularly ones that, would do worse at home. So, I think that's where the conversation is right now.
I hope the idea is quietly fading away. The idea that we're just going to completely and permanently cut down the youth jail facility, because I think the fear has been, and I'm not aware of this kind of respite. I
should read Publicola.
Yeah, I should read it more closely, apparently. But the fear has always been that when you have a juvenile offender, say, committed a homicide, and if we're gonna shut down the youth jail, what are you gonna do? You're gonna end up housing, you're not gonna let them go, you're gonna house them with the adult population, which I think is a really terrible idea. So I hope, Erica, that you're right and that they're kind of backing off some of the more, the sillier aspects of this. But I also will say this, like, I don't think I think we do a terrible job here in Seattle and King County in utilizing time when people do go to jail. Where are the reentry programs? Where are the efforts to actually use that time to address people's underlying conditions? That there's a real lack of services and efforts within the jail structure right now that I think is a terrible, almost unconscionable missed opportunity to try to actually do something productive and help people while they are.
We had a couple follow-ups also on the question of prostitution. This one, if you decriminalize prostitution, would this somehow decrease exploitation, meaning pimps? So would you change that equation if you decriminalize prostitution? Is that part of the idea?
I think only if they did it right. I don't think you can just say, okay, we're gonna, eliminate enforcement or wipe out the law and just let things go on as in a kind of state of nature. And then I think you will get more exploitation and pimps and enforcement and violence around this kind of stuff. And I think that's to some extent of what has happened over on Aurora in recent years. And I do think if you're going to decriminalize, which I'm not opposed to as an idea, you've got to support systems in place, which, as Erica, as you say, I think absolutely correctly, that takes commitment and resources and creative thinking about policy. And, you got to put your money where your mouth is. And right now, that doesn't seem even remotely likely to happen anytime soon.
Just real quickly with decriminalization. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but also, decriminalization never solves the problem completely because there's always a black market for everything. I mean, if you look at marijuana, right? We decriminalized it and made it the most expensive in the entire country. And so now if you want a deal, you go online.
Oh, that's not, but that's legalization and regulation.
Sorry, legalization and regulation. But I mean, same general concept. There is still a black market for weed. And maybe it's because we didn't get the balance right that it's so large. But I mean, it is very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen when you decriminalize something or legalize it.
I know that when America criminalized prostitution, because it wasn't, there weren't more of a female owned and operated hands of organized crime, according to Ruth Rosen in the book The Lost Sisterhood. Anyway, throwing out a little bit of US history. But the question is, if you went in the opposite direction, would it actually improve things? It's not exactly clear, but it is one of those examples. Made it a lot worse. So it just seems like one of those issues. Anything you do, it's a bad situation. Almost anything you do.
Well, but you're talking about like patronizing, protect the women type of legislation. So
no, decriminalization isn't really. I mean,
I see what you're saying.
That's the intent.
Yeah, but I'm saying I don't think that they're analogous. I don't think that decriminalization is analogous to making prostitution illegal. I don't think it's just the same pendulum swinging back.
No, they're not. I'm saying in the early part of the 19th century, it wasn't enforced in America. So anyway, here's another one. You talked about the Nordic model. I know nothing of this. What are countries in Europe doing regarding prostitution? I mentioned that just because the Nordic model, as I understand it, refers to, prosecuting Johns and not prostitutes. And that's what has been tried in countries like, I don't know, Norway.
I think that the idea is rather than looking at the women who are engaging in prostitution as sort of criminals themselves, right? Is to see them as being sort of victims or exploited by a system, right? And that by focusing on the Johns, who are the ones who are paying them, who are kind of making use of this sort of in this exploitative way of the service, it's a more fair way of getting at people that have more culpability or.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
prostitutes are victims. Why would you further victimize them
Right.
by arresting them?
Well,
Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's
but
part of that, but then it's like, maybe it made things.
And Davison is, the city attorney is prosecuting Johns again and literally taking them to trial, which is incredibly expensive. And so one thing that defense attorneys tell me is that the Johns, like the sex workers themselves, are overwhelmingly men of color, and a lot of them don't speak English as a first language. And so, you're seeing these cases where you're having trials for like a guy who offered $60 for sex. I don't think that's a particular. So I think that we've moved away from that model a little bit, just because it hasn't been proven that, that these guys that are out there, saying, offering $60, $80 for sex are really, the root of the problem.
It's if you remove the demand, but you
You will
can't-
never
you're
remove the
not removing
demand
it.
for sex work. It's never going to go away.
Like I said, we can go back to the back pages discussion. I think if you kind of,
Oh, no,
Take it off
just
there.
don't go back there.
yeah.
All right, we're gonna end on this one. This is a good one. Tell us something positive. What is Seattle? We've never had this question. I just have to tell us something positive. What is Seattle doing right that you both agree on?
Ooh, oh man.
It's an impossible question.
Yeah, there's no, definitely.
What's Seattle doing right? I mean,
Right now,
you've really caught us flat-footed.
yeah. I mean, there's some stuff around, look, I think there's a push afoot to try to, and look, Tammy Morales's misfire law, I think sort of fits into this, but I think there really is a push and significant momentum behind eliminating some of the regulatory and structural roadblocks to actually building housing in the city of Seattle. There's a push to get rid of design review, which is a sort of onerous process where you've got to go before these. But we've ranted about this on the podcast before, which adds all this time and cost, and these architects sort of who think they're Jane Jacobs sort of come in and tell you got to like change the color of the bricks over here or whatever, and it just ends up making things a lot more bureaucratic and taking longer and a lot more expensive. So I think there is some push to try to streamline some of that stuff. And I think we would both agree that that would be a good thing.
I think that's true. I will say Dan Strauss wanted to add design review to affordable housing in his plan. I mean, I think the fact that so the comprehensive plan, which is like the big planning document that guides housing development and transportation in the city for 20 years. I think that there has been, so it came out, I've been pretty critical of it, on my site. I am like a density radical. And so, I mean, I'm from Houston, you guys, I can't help it. Which has no zoning. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's been a lot of pushback on the version that Bruce Harrell announced to, add a little more, density inside of neighborhood centers and just a little bit, not so much making everybody live directly on Aurora and directly on Rainier, like people who rent, like me, who can't afford to buy a house in the city of Seattle. And I think that's a good thing. I don't know how friendly of a crowd I'm in for that perspective. but I think that's and I think the fact that the comprehensive plan, even the version that came out, is sort of gesturing towards all that is so different than where we were even in Ed Murray's administration when his density plan got leaked and he had to walk it back immediately.
The certain single family zoning stuff. Yeah. I'm actually hearing a few noises out of the council that make me think there's more sympathy for adding a little more density into the comp plan from the mayor's proposal than than I would have guessed going in. And so I do agree with you. I think that's a good thing. I think they should add a little more opportunity for
to be clear, I think they should add a lot more.
right. I mean, just because I tweeted this out when the original Rockland mayor's proposal came out. I mean, there was a lot of kind of gnashing to build enough housing and housing prices are gonna soar to these exorbitant levels, beyond, well, beyond where they are now. And, and I pointed out, like, you know what? San Francisco, we should, if you're pro density, we should aspire to come to San Francisco because they're way more dense than Seattle. I mean, San Francisco has 18,000 some people per square mile. We're at 8,000 something. So there's a long way to go.
Because of your yard.
What that just is that there is substantial opportunity, low-hanging fruit for us to add more housing and growth to help deal with both the growth of the city, the people coming in, as well as to try to hold the line on housing.
They both agree on density. That's a great place to end. That's it for another edition. That's it for another edition of Seattle Nice. She's Erica C. Barnett. He's Sandeep Kaushik. I'm David Hyde. Our editor is Quinn Waller. And thanks so much to everyone here at the Howler Lake Community Club.
Yeah.
For the order election this month, there are a few ballots here.
Yes, and that's a more.